Welcome to the first episode of International Law Chat, a podcast from the American branch of the International Law Association, or ABILA for short. I'm Chiara Giorgetti and I am a professor of international law at Richmond Law School and a senior fellow at the International Claims and Reparation Project at Columbia Law School.
And I'm Alison MacDonald, a barrister at Essex Court Chambers in London and a fellow at All Souls College in Oxford.
Our podcast will air on the first Monday of every month, and we hope you will be able to join us for half an hour or so. I am very pleased to be here today with my co-host and our guest to chat about international law. Our first guest today is Oona Hathaway. She's Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law at Yale Law School and President-elect of the American Society of International Law. Welcome, Oona.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, thank you again for coming. We're particularly really pleased to have you as a first guest of our first episode to our podcast. We think it is really particularly important at the present time to speak about international law and try to understand and maybe assess what is going on. It's such interesting and there's so much happening. Now, the Trump administration has been extraordinarily active in the international law space and has in many ways changed the international rule of law and the post-World War II consensus with a series of executive actions that have sought to recast long-held U.S. position in terms of really many key issues, ranging from the use of force to the acquisition of territory to boundaries, trade, and has even suggested the deportation of 2 million people as a way to obtain peace. In fact, there are so many actions going on every day that it's been difficult to keep track. So, Oona, as a first question, could you explain to us and to our listeners that maybe don't follow as much as we do, can you tell us a little more about some of the most consequential and maybe even troubling actions taken by the Trump administration in this extraordinary period?
Yeah, well, as you say, it really is an extraordinary period, and it's quite different from what we saw in the first Trump administration. So in the first Trump administration, there was some animosity to international law and withdrawal from international treaties and sanctions against the International Criminal Court, all of which is happening again this time around. But this time is different, I think, in character, speed, and extent of the attack on the international legal order. So the Trump administration has repeated some of the things it did the first time around, as I mentioned, so withdrawing from the World Health Organization, withdrawing from a number of international agreements, the Paris Agreement on climate change, pulling back from a number of international organizations the U.S. has been not only a part of, but champion of for a long time, even sort of signaling that maybe membership in the United Nations might be on the table, although haven't heard a lot about that recently, so I don't know if they're still serious about that. So all of that is troubling, but some of it not so unexpected. What is especially concerning to me, and I think was not something that any of us really anticipated, was the degree to which the Trump administration has been willing to attack directly really the fundamental norms of the international legal order in the post-war era. And in my view, that the kind of really most troubling actions have been the threats to engage in use of force, to engage in territorial aggression. So the threats, which seem to be ongoing against Greenland, sort of suggesting that we might take it by force, that it'll become part of the United States one way or the other. They're sort of not clear if it's by force or by buying it, but it seems clear they're not interested in selling. So if it's going to become part of the United States, it's going to have to somehow be coercive. The threats against Canada to make it the 51st state, which again, Canada has made clear it's not interested in being the 51st state. threats against Panama over the Panama Canal and sort of trumped up claims that there's violations of the neutrality treaty as an excuse for potentially using force against Panama and strong-arming Panama into agreeing to take migrants, partially to try and placate the Trump administration and hopefully hold off aggression. And so just in a whole host of ways, really throwing out this deep commitment that the United States championed from the 1920s onward and made a core of the United Nations Charter, and that is this prohibition on use of force and territorial aggression. And this matters because these are not just sort of individual actions that we're seeing, so we can look at each one of these and sort of shake our head and say, oh, that's terrible, that they're going after Greenland, or it's terrible they're going after Panama, it's terrible they're going after Canada. But it's not just these individual actions. These seem to reflect a kind of worldview that is fundamentally at odds with the post-war international legal order. And even making the threats is deeply damaging to that post-war legal order, because it puts on the table the idea that the unthinkable is now thinkable, that the idea that we can use force to change territory has just not been on the table in the post-war era. And the U.S. has been the champion of that idea. And now if the U.S. is sort of flipping over and thinking that, well, maybe it's going to use force to threaten or to maybe even take territory, that just upends the international legal order. And to me, that is just different in kind from anything we saw in Trump 1. And that's even not even mentioning what's happening in Ukraine, which is also of a piece with this, the pressure on Ukraine to give up territory to Russia, the pressuring Ukraine into international agreements of various kinds, potentially to give up mineral rights as the price of U.S. continued support, pressing them into this agreement to allow Russia to export its commodities. So it really is a kind of deep assault on the post-war international order across the board, and that's what is really worrying me as I watch what's unfolding.
Thank you. Yes, but when you think about everything that's happening, it is really troubling, because it seems that there's something happening in kind of all of the spheres of international law. And I wonder if I can just follow up on this. So many observers think that this is so big and so consequential. It is almost like an existential attack to the international legal order, as you said, the post-World War II legal order that we had, and will require a complete remaking, rebalancing of that system that we had. Others, however, think that international law is resilient and has developed certain tools and instruments that can resist such attacks, including, for example, the use of international courts like the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, or the empowerment of, for example, within the United Nations, the General Assembly instead of the Security Council, or maybe a bigger role for Europe, the Council of Europe, for example. How do you see that situation where you sit, both as an academic, but also very much as a practitioner? Where do you stand in these two different views?
I mean, the hopeful side of me wants to think that maybe those who see, these alternative centers of power are right. And certainly, I think that is possible. I think it's too early to tell for sure just yet. So there are tools available to states that want to champion the international order. There is, as you say, the General Assembly, which empowers states who are not part of the Security Council to nonetheless act on behalf of the United Nations. And there have been some ways in which the General Assembly has taken on greater authority since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with something that's called the Veto Initiative, which was put in place that basically says that whenever a Security Council resolution is vetoed by the Security Council, it's automatically referred to the General Assembly, which takes it up within 10 days and can take action on the matter that the Security Council might have refused to. And that's a way of sort of shifting some power towards the General Assembly, which I think is a good thing, and potentially means that there could be other actors that could fill some of the gap left by the Security Council, which thanks to now both the US and, of course, Russia and China, which have together really impeded a kind of progressive, proactive Security Council. Having the General Assembly being able to kind of step into that breach, I think is a hopeful possibility. But I am concerned that without U.S. leadership, it's not clear who's going to take up the mantle, who's going to lead the charge. When the veto initiative went into effect in 2022, it was the U.S. who was very supportive of it. And the U.S. was whipping some of the votes in favor of the Ukraine resolutions. And that's part of the reason you got 143 states voting in favor of the resolutions condemning Russia. And with the U.S. on the other side of the ledger, the numbers dropped substantially. The more recent resolution was in the 90s, which is a big drop-off and suggests that the General Assembly is a little rudderless at the moment, and I think is not entirely clear if it's prepared to step in and play that role without somebody taking a leadership position. And, so far it's not clear who's going to take that leadership position. I also think the international courts are a really important actor here, and the ICJ has been extraordinarily important in stepping into some of the most critical geopolitical conflicts of our time. It has cases in front of it, both in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and in the Israeli conflict, the South Africa v. Israel case, which was brought under the Genocide Convention, and the Ukraine case was also brought under the Genocide Convention. But the ICJ is not without its limits on its power. I'm a big champion of ICJ. I think the ICJ plays an extraordinarily important role in articulating international legal principles and standing up for international law. And I think it's been brave to move forward on these cases. And I very much believe in legalizing these disputes, which is what bringing these disputes to the ICJ does. But I'm also worried about what's going to happen when these decisions are issued and then states just ignore them. And formally, the enforcement mechanism is referral to the Security Council, which of course is not really going to get us anywhere these days. And then the question becomes, well, if that's not going to work, are other states, again, the question, are other states going to step in to enforce these decisions? And I think that they legally can. I actually think that ICJ decisions are erga omnes obligations, which are obligations owed to all states, and that states are legally entitled, therefore, to put in place countermeasures or sanctions to enforce ICJ decisions. But again, you kind of need somebody willing to lead the charge, somebody to rally the troops, somebody to bring states together to do that. Now, there are a few signs that there might be some out there willing to do that. There's this new group, which I haven't heard a lot about, but has formed, they call themselves the Hague Group. And this group of states, which is states from across different continents who have formed to enforce international in support of international courts, so both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. And, so that's a little inkling of a sign that maybe some states are willing to step in to support these courts. They've not been clear exactly what they mean and what they're going to do. But yes, I think that there's possibilities, but right now there are things that states can do if they want to do them. What's less clear at this moment is whether the states are going to want to do these things, are going to have the political will to step up to support and defend the international legal order. And I do think there's a question as to whether Europe can do it all on its own. I think probably the answer is that it can't, and that it needs to find supporters of the international order from outside Europe. And that doesn't always come naturally to Europe. And there's a longstanding, I think, kind of ambivalence about international law in parts of the world that sometimes see international law as an excuse for meddling in their affairs. And I think it's going to require some rethinking of how we approach states outside the West about supporting the international order and trying to make the case that this is in the interest of all states. And in many ways, most of it of interest to states in the kind of post-colonial world who have an experience of what it's like to have their territory taken and aggressed by other states and have this history of experience with that. And so I think can understand why these norms are so important. But I think we haven't done the work yet that's necessary to bring these states on board and supporting the international order. So, again, I believe that all the tools are there. I think there's legal mechanisms, there are institutional mechanisms for states to be able to do that. But I think everyone's a little bit paralyzed. I mean, no one was expecting the speed or the aggression that the Trump administration has gone after the international system, and everyone's a little bit stunned. And I think everyone's kind of waiting for someone to take the lead and to figure out how to push back. And we don't yet know who those leaders are going to be and how they're going to bring everyone else along. And that's I think what we have to hope for if the international order is going to survive this assault. And it might not. Unfortunately, I think there's a real possibility that this is kind of the death blow of what was already a fairly fragile system, and that we're going to see a radical reorganization, and it could be quite dire. I mean, we could see a situation where, Russia is able to sort of bully the states in its sphere of influence. China is able to bully the states in its sphere of influence. And the U.S. is able to bully the states in its sphere of influence, and they're able to extract concessions and force states into, forced agreements. We're going to be back in the world of gunboat diplomacy and, perhaps territorial aggression. I think that's a very real possibility. Yeah. So, I mean, I do hope that we see states rally to the cause of international law, but I haven't yet seen signs that there's that political will just yet. But I hope it will emerge, because I think it's really critically important for all states to support and defend these basic principles of the international system.
Now, you mentioned Europe, and I'm taking part in this conversation from my desk in London. And one thing I've been wondering over the past week, following the way that we saw President Zelensky treated at the White House, and following that, Europe stepping up its support for Ukraine, is whether you see other parts of the world as a potential check and balance against the current conduct of the US, not just through the UN, which you just discussed, and the challenges of the General Assembly, but through those states' own direct actions and diplomacy. And I guess my question is whether you think that protecting Ukraine is test case of political will and leadership, both in Europe and beyond.
I do. I mean, I do think that Ukraine is sort of like test case number one. Because, look, this is the most severe challenge to the United Nations Charter's prohibition on use of force and territorial aggression that we've seen since World War II. A much more powerful neighbor seizing the territory of a neighbor state with no justification whatsoever, violating international humanitarian law left and right in the process. And, if we can't stand up to this, then that's, a sign that the international order is pretty broken. And Ukraine fought this war from the beginning with all the tools of international law. The reason it has survived is that from the beginning, it made its case that it was on the right side of international law and Russia was on the wrong side of international law, and that defending Ukraine was essential to defending the international order. And it was saying that again and again. And that argument was persuasive to a lot of states who didn't necessarily see, a particular self-interest in defending Ukraine qua Ukraine, but saw this as essential to standing up to Russia's assault on the international order. And so you saw these General Assembly resolutions, which called out the violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter and specifically named those as clear violations, and again called what Russia was doing in Ukraine illegal, and Ukraine's bringing the case in the ICJ under the Genocide Convention to again getting it called illegal and get the ICJ to order Russia to withdraw. I mean, it's been fighting with law from the very beginning. And throughout, it has been using international law as its weapon to push back against a much more powerful state. And other states have been persuaded by that and have supported that effort through expansive sanctions against Russia for its illegal actions in Ukraine, and through providing unprecedented financial and military support to Ukraine without directly intervening with their own troops in Ukraine, but providing intelligence, providing weapons, providing money, providing very extensive support for Ukraine to allow it to defend itself. Without that, Ukraine would have collapsed within a matter of weeks, but it had this international support. Now, with the U.S. pulling back, obviously Ukraine is going to need other states to step up. And Europe has been leading the charge in that, and I think it's critical that it continues to play that role and that it continue to support Ukraine, because Ukraine is kind of the first stop, not the last stop for Russia if this territorial aggression succeeds and they're able to annex parts of Ukraine. It's highly unlikely that that's where Putin is going to stop. And I think Europe recognizes that and has the history of a more aggressive Soviet Union in the past, and recognizes that this is not just Ukraine that's at stake, but that all of Europe that's at stake. So I do think this is very much a test case. I also think that, European publics are tired of this. I also think, like in the United States, people are kind of tired of sending money overseas, and people are tired of paying higher prices for energy, and people are tired of the conflict. And so I think it's a political challenge for leaders in Europe to now not only continue doing what they're doing, but try to fill the gap that's left by U.S. absence. And that's going to be a tall order, but I think it's absolutely essential, because if Ukraine falls and Putin succeeds, that's a sign that there's a payoff, that Putin was right, that the West gives up after a while. If you just stick with it long enough, you're going to win. And that sends a message not just to Putin, but to any state considering aggression. Obviously, the first place we think of is China and the possible aggression in Taiwan. But there are lots of states that might find their wealthy neighbors appealing targets. And if the rules no longer apply, then why not, invade and take over territory if that's no longer prohibited? So I think I hope Europe will continue to fill that gap. We certainly hear leaders, coming to the defense of Ukraine. And we saw a lot of really important signs after that terrible Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, where, Zelensky met a much warmer reception in Europe and in Great Britain, which was kind of hopeful and, an antidote to a little bit to what we had seen in the Oval Office. And I think maybe the upside of the Oval Office meeting is it just laid bare kind of where the Trump administration is on this. Nobody could sort of fool themselves after that to think that the Trump administration really is going to provide support to Ukraine. It's pretty clear that they're not. And if there's going to be support, that support is going to have to come from Europe. But then the question becomes, is Europe up to that? Is it willing to fill that gap? Is it going to continue to provide that support at the same moment when it also is starting to invest more in its own defense, and where the U.S. is now pulling back from foreign aid around the world, and there's calls on Europe to fill some of that gap as well, with the USAID collapsing and all these important international initiatives falling apart. People are asking for Europe to step in there as well. And the question is Europe willing and able to fill these gaps? And I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's a lot to ask, at a time when, again, European publics are like the American public, not necessarily fully on board with taking on that role. And so I remain hopeful that they will, but I'm also aware that there's a lot of political cross currents here that may not make that difficult. And that's why I think if we're really going to succeed, if we're going to defend the international order, if we're going to be able to kind of hold the tide back, it is going to be necessary to bring more states into this defense of the international order. And I think it is going to be necessary to start thinking about how do we bring in states that have a stake in this to also play a role in trying to defend the international system. And I mean, the one hopeful piece of this is, look, the U.S. has been sort of holding things together for a long time, and the world has really relied on the U.S. to be the key actor in enforcing international legal rules, and the muscles have atrophied in other countries. And if the U.S. has just made very clear, look, it's not going to do this anymore, then it does call the question, in a sense. Are states going to be willing to step in? Do they value a peaceful world where states are not permitted to use force against one another to seek their whims and will? Or are we going to be back to where we were in the pre-1920s era, where states could threaten and use force to, impose their will on their neighbors and other states? And I think, when states confront that reality, maybe they'll see that they too have a real interest in maintaining this international order and step up to defend it. But I hope that they don't come to that realization too late.
Against that turbulent background that you've just very powerfully sketched, one thing that really resonated with me recently is a post on Yale Talk where Professor Hathaway writes that, I quote, and I love this quote, being an international lawyer can sometimes feel like being a librarian in the middle of a riot. You are deeply invested in the idea that there are rules, impeccable legal rules, that, if followed, would make the world a better, more orderly place. If only people would stop upturning chairs and setting things on fire long enough to listen. And as I say, that really resonated with me. And with that in mind, do you think that there are things, we've been talking about state actors, we've been talking about multilateral institutions, do you think there are things that lawyers can do to communicate the importance of international law to the public? Or is that just overstating the importance of lawyers?
I do think that we have a responsibility to try to explain this. And, what I think is interesting about that analogy is, like, there's some truth to it, obviously. But I think that what is interesting about modern international law is that it's the background of our lives. It's a set of rules, yes, but it's rules that we just kind of take for granted, in a sense. Like, we have taken for granted in our lives, or at least I have taken for granted in my life, that you don't just invade your neighbor when they fail to pay a debt, or that, they don't do what you want them to do. Like, that we live in a world in which that's just off the table as an acceptable way of resolving disputes between nations. And I think part of what we can convey is that's not always been true. We're very lucky to live in a world in which those have been the norms, those have been the expectations, that states don't invade their neighbors, that they don't use force against one another. And that is a world order that was constructed by people who came before us, who, were in the wake of World War I and World War II, who had experienced untold violence and seen what it produces when states can resort to violence against one another to try and wield their wills on one another, and came up with this international system to try and give us a measure of peace. And while we can point to all the failures, and there's many of them, and there's the upturning of chairs, and there's there's some of the chaos that goes on around us, but actually what's remarkable is how powerful and effective that system has been. And the fact we haven't had not a world war, but that we've had very few wars between states in the post-45 era. Yes, there have been some, and I'm not going to claim that it's been perfect, and there's been lots of civil wars, and there's lots of problems that we can point to. Yes, 100%, first to admit that. But we shouldn't just look at the breakdown in the law. We should see the background of, like, remarkable success. And all of the things that this world that we live in that we take for granted, and that we're so lucky to have a chance to experience. And that, to explain, I think, that is in large part a product of international law and of these fundamental rules of the international system, and the fact that states have agreed not to resort to force against one another unilaterally to enforce their will, and that we all have a stake in that. We all have benefited from it, and we all have a reason to want to defend that. And that part of the work when you do this, when you look at this historically, so my work wrote this book, The Internationalist, has sort of looked back at sort of the history and what created the modern legal order and how did they come up with these ideas and what did it look like before? And when you look back in history, states would just go to war against one another for all kinds of reasons. For debt collection, for interference with trade relations, for balance of power concerns, for all kinds of reasons. And being a person in that era was not great. Like you were constantly being buffeted by the forces of these powers who are fighting with one another over territory. If you're a civilian living there, your life is, constantly being upturned. And we all have an interest in defending these fundamental principles. And when the U.S. puts them at risk, it's putting at risk not just, Greenland or Panama or Canada. It's putting at risk these basic principles of the international order that have brought unprecedented peace and security over most of the last 8 decades. And so much that we take for granted as a result of that. And I think that part of our role is to try to explain some of that and to make clear that the furniture that we sort of take for granted in the international legal order is not something we can take for granted. Like it is something that every generation has to do its work to maintain and strengthen and reinforce. And right now, our generation is tearing it apart. And I think we need to recognize the costs of that and try to do the best that we can to sort of resist it.
What would you say? I'm thinking of the future now, and I'm thinking of lawyers who are perhaps coming of age as lawyers in this period. And I'm wondering, what would you say? I wondered, I asked myself this when people speak to me about potential careers. And what would you say to an enthusiastic young lawyer who's thinking of going into international law? Is that still a good idea, or will it be a life of misery and frustration?
Well, so I'm teaching international law at Yale Law School right now. So I have about 60 students that I'm teaching. I literally just taught this morning international law, human rights law today. And, so I think a lot about this question, what am I training them to go into? What is the world that, they're going to be entering? And, I still do believe that international law does a lot of work. I mean, we have all these international legal institutions, we have international arbitration, we have all these ways in which international law continues to shape our lives. And there's a field of international law that desperately needs these young people to go into it. But I also think that one thing to bear in mind, and this is again where looking at history is helpful, is that international law is a process of constant kind of reconstruction and construction. We're constantly creating it and reinventing it. And the internationalists writing this book, The Internationalist, we called it The Internationalist because we named it after the kind of the people who were responsible for creating the modern international legal order. And they were kind of ordinary people. They weren't particularly famous. They weren't, elected officials. They were ordinary people who had a vision for the international legal order and who had a vision for a world of international peace and who were working hard to try and think through what might work. How might we create an international system that could sustain international peace in a moment when, and they were thinking about this, like in the 1920s, in the wake of the World War I and, failed efforts at disarmament, and in the 1930s and in the midst of World War II, they're writing the UN Charter, from 1942 onward, even as the war is in the midst of happening. And like the most terrible violence is underway. And they're able to see the possibility that there could be a different world and that we could construct an international order based on peace and security and cooperation, even as the most terrible violence in the world is happening around them. And so, if they could see that, then we should too. And I think our job as international lawyers is to try to explain and understand what's happening, but also to try and imagine a different future and then do our best to try and bring it about.
Thank you. Oona, I was thinking, you mentioned, we have about 1 minute left. But you mentioned your students and now their role also, and I am also, of course, I'm also teaching, and I'm thinking, you're teaching international law, I'm teaching human rights tomorrow. So just very short question for you. I'm interested in speaking like an academic. What do you think? Is there a special, unique role in kind of this kind of situation? Is there a special role that we should play as an academic? And now, especially as the academic institution is also under attack, is there a special function? Is there a special role that we should play?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I think obviously as teachers, our critical role in trying to explain what's happening to our students, to explain the importance and meaning of international law, to give students the tools to analyze and understand what they see unfolding around them. And I find it also important not to deny what's happening. I mean, I think there's a way in which, you can be teaching this, and sometimes it feels like you're sort of teaching a history class as you're teaching, I taught international humanitarian law, teaching human rights law, and teaching trade law. Like sometimes you feel like, is any of this still meaningful? Because we're seeing these like constant violations. I think creating space for that conversation, not denying that those challenges are in front of us, but say, here's what the law is, here's how we understand it, here's how it's functioned, here's why it is the way that it is. And then what are we seeing? What are the consequences going to be of this attack that we're seeing unfold? What can we expect? And what are some ways in which it's responsible to respond to that? Both, ourselves as academics in trying to explain to the public, why these international legal rules matter and why they ought to be defended. And then also trying to think about new possibilities, because I think what we're discovering is there's a certain amount of this is about trying to defend what we have and trying to maintain the international legal order that has been so powerful over the last 8 decades at maintaining international peace and security. But I think at the same time, admitting the shortcomings of that international system, admitting the fact that it's been deeply imperfect, and thinking about whether this moment of crisis is a moment at which we can also begin to reimagine what that international legal order might look like, to bring in more states as central players in the international system, to not just have the US and Europe leading the way, but thinking about how to bring in states from Africa and Asia and Latin and South America as not just, signing on to the things that the West comes up with, but as co-creators of the modern international legal order. And, if we could do that, that would be a remarkable achievement. And so thinking about ways to take this crisis and not just try to hold things together with, duct tape and spit, but to try to find some ways to see the opportunity for reinvention and improvement in this moment. That's, I think, part of our job as well.
Well, to wrap things up on that note, huge thanks to Oona for being our first guest and being so generous in sharing your insights with us today, including even some sparks of optimism. I really enjoyed our conversation, and if those who are listening have too, you can join us on the first Monday of every month for more international law chats.